Hello again, folks. Today we're moving into the 10th chapter of Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. And in the first section here, Paul does something that really all of us should do in our own lives, and that is reflect on the past, particularly on past mistakes. Not dwell on them, of course, but reflect on and learn from them. And he points the Corinthian believers to days gone by, to the Israelites who were saved from Egyptian slavery by the Lord. And as much as these people were rescued in a tremendous display of God's power, as much as their freedom was secured and won, and they were promised a land to live in, as much as they were given laws to govern their ways of life and to protect the vulnerable and the needy, they still fell away from the Lord. They still let their sin overtake them, and they rejected God's grace and faithfulness. And in the end, many of them succumbed to death and all kinds of difficulty. Many of them were simply not included in God's plan for a promised land. They showed their true colours. They revealed their darkened, hardened hearts. They set their hearts on evil things, as Paul says in verse 6. He says they became idolaters, and they even put the Lord to the test. And Paul's warning is clear. Do not be like them. Don't fall from God's blessing and his favour. He says in verse 12, you might think you're standing firm. You might think you're doing great. You're setting a great example. You're just sort of perfect in every way. But be careful. He's saying, don't be so arrogant as if you're somehow impenetrable from sin. Don't think for a second that you are beyond sinfulness. Temptation abounds. There is sin all around us in this world. And Paul wants these people to stand firm as temptation surrounds them. He wants them to keep their eyes fixed on the Lord, on his goodness, his grace, his mercy, and his love. Then into the second section, Paul narrows his focus to the specific issue of idol feasts and the Lord's Supper. Now, this is something he has touched on earlier a little bit, and hopefully this is not a specific problem that many of us have in our lives, but it clearly was a problem that some of these Corinthian believers were falling foul of. In their culture, these pagan temples were very popular, and often there would be these feasts where meat was sacrificed and drinks were offered up before these idols, and then everyone would just kind of share in all this together as a symbol that they were one. And clearly some of these Corinthian converts had convinced themselves that even though they were now Christians, it was all right to take part in these feasts and festivals because, well, maybe their spirituality was such that they were practically impenetrable. Now, Paul is obviously clearly going to say no to that, but he deals with it carefully. So he's already told them in chapter 8, and he restates it here in verses 19 and 20. The food itself that's offered to the idols, that's not the issue. It's just food. These idols aren't real. It's all a load of nonsense. There is only one God. So the food that's being sacrificed is not the issue. What the issue is, he challenges them really to do with their attitudes. So he talks in verses 20 and 21, and he's really saying, why would you want to do this? Why would you want to be part of this idolatrous feast? These sacrifices and the feasts, they're all part of this idolatrous practice. They have the mark of Satan all over them. They take people's eyes off the Lord and onto man-made idols and gods. And so Paul's really saying, don't get involved. Have nothing to do with it. And that's an important lesson and an important principle for us even today. And as I said, hopefully we're not really taking part in any of these kind of idolatrous feasts to pagan gods. But what are the idols that we are susceptible to in today's culture? What are the idols that we do build up around us and even embrace? Is it things like fame and celebrity? Is it things like money and power, politics, sport? There are idols everywhere around us. And the warning that repeatedly comes from Scripture is steer clear. There is only one God, and he alone is to be worshipped. Paul finishes the chapter then with a really interesting discussion about freedom of conscience as a believer, and something that is very important and needs to be thought through for all those who consider themselves to be followers of Christ. So Paul endorses freedom of conscience, saying that as a Christian, we're to use our own God-given minds to consider what is okay for us to do in certain circumstances, maybe circumstances that are not quite so black and white, maybe a little bit more around the grey, the shades of grey. And in Christian life, as we know from reading the Bible, there are absolutes, but there are also these kind of non-essentials. So, for example, murder. Well, that's an absolute no. Lying. Well, that's an absolute no. Idolatry, adultery, drunkenness, greed. All absolutely wrong, clearly sinful. But what about something like watching television? Well, the Bible doesn't speak too much about that. Is that an absolute no? Or would that fall under that kind of non-essential category? And this is where Paul's principle kicks in. He's really saying you've got to use your freedom of conscience, God-given, to decide whether it's right or wrong. If watching TV makes you susceptible to sin and more likely to fall into temptation, then ultimately you've got to decide that actually I shouldn't be doing that. So Jesus says if your right hand causes you to sin, he doesn't say use it a little bit less. He says cut it off, get rid of it. But if you can watch television and it has no negative effect on your faith or behaviour in any way, then perhaps you can say, okay, yes, this is okay for me to do. But there is one condition that Paul talks about. He warns you also need to consider those around you. Make sure that you don't cause anyone else to stumble in their faith just so that you can have the freedom of conscience that you crave. That would be a travesty. We ought to be willing even to sacrifice our freedoms, to lay aside that freedom for the sake of others. That's the attitude that we should have. So that's a lot for us to think through there. That's our time up for today. Join us tomorrow then as we continue into chapter 11. Until then, God bless.